Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Palestine Sermons, a conversation with Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl. I'm Mahan Mirza, visiting Vice President for Academic Affairs at American Islamic College. In 2006, President Jimmy Carter observed in his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, that Gaza has been left as a, quote, tiny and non-viable economic and political entity, circumscribed, isolated, with no dependable access to the air, sea, or even other Palestinians, end quote. The last chapter of President Carter's book is called "The Wall is a Prison." Nearly 2 decades after the publication of his book, in April 2023, Foreign Affairs magazine published an article, Israel's One-State Reality, according to which, in a hierarchy of rights, and I quote, the fullest class of citizenship is reserved for Israeli Jews. Palestinians with Israeli citizenship have some political and civil rights, but confront other limits. Palestinians who reside in the occupied territories are the lowest class of all, with those in Gaza at the bottom, end quote. As we speak, preaches Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, as we speak, Israel is once again pounding Gaza, targeting not only civilians, but civilian infrastructure. These words are from a sermon delivered on May 14th, 2021. 2 days prior to the delivery of this sermon, a headline on France 24 announced, "Mob lynching of Arab aired on live Israeli TV." This also appears as a footnote in his book. Ta-Nehisi quotes did not return from Palestine with a new revelation. He returned as a witness who confirmed the testimonies of American presidents, various organs of the United Nations, and every credible human rights organization under the sun. The Israel's One-State Reality article of April 2023 predicted, a storm is gathering in Israel and Palestine, portending profound instability in the Middle East. On October 7th, 2023, the storm arrived. There are those who say that nobody could have predicted October 7th, that prior to October 7th, there was a ceasefire, that history began on October 7th. They're simply wrong. History did not begin on October 7th. History led to October 7th. This is not an opinion, it's a fact. We are privileged to have with us Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, a scholar and believer, teacher and preacher, whose recent sermons, the Palestine Sermons, are now in print. He bears witness to the arc of history that has brought us to the present moment. Among his many contentions is that Israel-Palestine is not just a political issue. It's an issue that's deeply relevant to Islamic theology. After Gaza, he preaches, everything has to change and nothing else matters. Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl is the Umar and Esmeralda Alfi Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA Law School, at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, political asylum and refugee law, the trafficking of human beings, law and policy, political crimes and legal systems, and Muslims, race and law. Professor Abou El Fadl guides the work of the Usuli Institute, a team of dedicated academics, professionals, and volunteers that are passionate about the beauty of the Islamic tradition. His written and spoken words can be found at usuli.org, that's USULI.org, and searchforbeauty.org, one word, search for beauty. He will speak now for about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a conversation with me, and then a question and answer and discussion session for the remainder of the time with all of you who have joined us online. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, Professor Khaled Abu El Fadl, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. Um, of course, the book, the Palestine Sermons, comes or grew out of a series of sermons, lectures that were transformed into an essay form. And in the relevance is that I didn't see what transpired, as was mentioned in October 7th, as surprising, because there are certain historical facts, regardless of how much there is an effort to whitewash and obscure rather uncontestable facts. Now, so fact, it's not just that the Gaza Strip is an entirely dependent, non-viable political entity, but the entire Palestine polity, if you will, all the territories of Palestine after Camp David and after the Oslo Accords, sorry, are entirely dependent political entities. They are segmented, broken into little, if you will, encampments that are entirely dependent on the Israeli economy for their existence. By definition, what has emerged, and this is not coincidental, this is quite intentional. Israel, since the Oslo Accords, has very deliberately not just colonized and continued to create settlements and to colonize Palestinian lands, but have divided Palestinian polities into these encampments. Okay, so what the word apartheid is inevitable. I mean, it is delusional that we avoid the word apartheid, or that all the supporters of Israel do all types of cartwheels to avoid the word apartheid, but it is a reality. It is a reality for anyone that studies the Palestinian economy, for anyone that studies the Palestinian reality. Palestinians under occupation are an entirely dependent, entirely controlled, entirely non-autonomous. The level of autonomy is non-existent, and it is a reality that Israel, as Israeli law itself recognizes, is a state for Jews, and that they are the premier citizens of the state, and everyone else within the state is second or third or class or on the margins, etc. The question, though, now, as I discuss in the Palestine Sermons, anyone that follows Israeli media and anyone that follows Israeli in debates and intellectual discourses, Israel has not concealed or attempted to obfuscate or even attempted to hide in any way that since Oslo, that their understanding of their relationship to the Palestinians is the logic of total victory. In numerous contexts, in Israeli media and Israeli scholarship, the narrative is, we've defeated the Palestinians. Their defeat is total and complete. It is akin to the defeat of Native Americans. And by the way, in Israeli scholarship and Israeli discourses, the parallel to Native Americans is drawn all the time. It's just that we don't pay attention to the very open discourses that Israel produces. And that in the same way that Native Americans accepted their defeat and basically settled for whatever the American white man was willing to give them, Palestinians likewise must settle for whatever we are willing to give them. And that it is time for Arabs to simply recognize that they've been defeated in a war. And so that logic, that very logic, which was affirmed by the annexation of Jerusalem and the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem and the deal of the century that we all witnessed was the Emirat and Saudi, and the sponsoring of the so-called the new version of Islam, the Abrahamic faith, ad-Din al-Ibrahimi, as it's called in the Emirat. All of this is part of that logic of, this is not just a Israeli-Palestinian issue. From, again, Israeli discourses, this is an Israeli-Muslim issue. Muslims, in order for Israel to exist and be safe in the region, Muslims must abandon the logic of resistance. Muslims must change their theology, in which the idea of Islam affecting politics must be completely abandoned. Muslims must restructure and reframe and reinvent their theology so that effectively, as we saw in the Abrahamic faith, whether you go to a church or you go to a synagogue or you go to a mosque, it's all the same. Religion has nothing to do with politics. In fact, by religion have nothing to do with politics, you're saying religion has nothing to do with life. The Islamic religion is just about doing your prayers in private. It's a relationship between you and God. It's a very private relationship that has no social program, nothing to say about justice, nothing to say about equity, so on. Okay, but I come back to this reality of an apartheid state. Why has I've been working in the human rights field for 30 years, and I have been very active in the human rights field. Why has Western powers, the dominant colonial powers in the world, have consistently created an exception for Israel when it comes to human rights doctrines and human rights epistemology in general? Why has it always been that when it comes to Israel, while we contrast the Western discourses on South Africa to the Western discourses of Israel, we are shocked at the huge disparity that one type of apartheid was entirely unacceptable, another type of apartheid, well, it's complicated and so on. I cannot separate the attitude of the West today from history, because the question is, what does history teach us? What does history tell us? But let me rephrase this in a different way. Why is it that the West has invested so much in creating the type of leadership in the Emirat with Mohammed bin Zayed, or in Saudi, or in Egypt, or in Jordan, or in Morocco, or in Sudan, the type of leadership that today consistently tells us, well, you know, all the 60s doctrines about national liberation and the right to resist colonialism and the right to resist occupation, let's forget about all of that. In fact, if you consistently study what Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirat, Morocco, and so on are saying in the UN, they've completely abandoned all the corpus, all the body of jurisprudence about national liberation and resistance to occupation and colonialism that was systematically generated in the 50s and 60s. In addition, we see a concerted effort of sponsoring theologians, in quotes, that come and tell Muslims, Jerusalem is not that important. Jerusalem is not that central. Why? The question is, why the Israeli exceptionalism? Why exceptionalism vis-a-vis Israeli apartheid? Why the enormous amount of effort to the extent, and by the way, I mean, remember that when the United States invaded Iraq, it said, we are creating a new Middle East. And when you read the literature, the new Middle East that they were conceptualizing, exactly the type of Middle East that dilutes the issue of Palestine, exactly a type of Middle East that dilutes Islamic theology itself and separates it from life, exactly the type of Middle East of Sisi of Egypt, of MBS of Saudi, of MBZ of the Emirat. Okay, I come back to remember the truest reflection of Islamicity is the Prophet ﷺ and those that were raised and shaped by the Prophet ﷺ. Why is this important? Because let's not forget that it was the companions of the Prophet ﷺ that were raised and their consciousness were formed by him. Their understanding of what Islam mandated and required were the ones that understood that Islam cannot survive unless there is a confrontation with Byzantians, and unless the Byzantians were kicked out of the east of the East, Arabic-speaking, Persian-speaking, Turkic-speaking East. And central to that was that the companions understood the place of Jerusalem in the religiosity of the East generally, and that for Islam to become a universal religion rather than a marginal desert phenomena, Jerusalem was critical to this project. And this is why the companions of the Prophet ﷺ ejected the Byzantians from Jerusalem. Now, here is a further thing that history teaches us. Every effort at the word I'm looking for is limiting and making the Islamic phenomena in history controllable and minimizing it. In other words, shrinking it. Every effort went through Jerusalem. In other words, every time that the West has attempted to make the Islamic, to control Islamic energy, to control the Islamic power, to control the Islamic reality, it went through getting to the heart of the Muslim world through Palestine because of Palestine's geographic locations, because of Palestine's role in history, because of Palestine's history of religiosity and its relationship to religion in general. Remember that all the monotheistic religions went through Palestine. So Palestine, in effect, meant you are controlling monotheism in the consciousness of humanity. So that is precisely why, and I believe that Muslims, historically, Muslims had an innate and an intuitive understanding of this. And this is precisely why you will find that thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslims sacrificed their lives throughout Islamic history to every time Palestine was lost to regain control of Palestine. Now, let's look at the historical moment today. With Israel being where Israel is, and right in the heart of the Muslim world, you cannot produce Islamic theology without factoring in Israel's acceptance or rejection. You cannot talk about Islamic unity without factoring in Israel's acceptance or rejection. You cannot talk about consolidating Islamic economy without, again, Israel's rejection or acceptance. You cannot even talk about Sharia or Islamic law without Israel's acceptance or rejections. Leave alone any notion of the Khilafah or a return of a symbol of Muslim unity and a symbol of the Muslim polity without, again, Israel's acceptance or rejections. So why the exceptionalism? Why is the West so forgiving when it comes to apartheid? Is that while the West has preached, everyone who has studied, student of international relations will tell you, oh, we learn that there has been a remove in the modern age from the age of ideologies to the age of realism. Well, I beg to differ. In fact, the one issue that the West remains thoroughly and fanatically ideological about is Israel. And why? Because it is the heart of the Muslim world. It is in the heart of the Muslim world. And the subjugation of Palestinians means the subjugation of Muslims. When Israel can murder 50,000 Palestinians and the Egyptians are watching and doing nothing, the Saudis are watching and doing nothing, the Jordanians are watching and doing nothing, they won't even terminate relations with Israel. They won't even punish Israel economically for its genocidal behavior. What that translates into is a defeat of Islam, a hegemonic control of Islam in today's world. And so India can do what it wants to do in Kashmir and know that Muslims are defeated. They have no bite. China can do what it wants to do with Muslims and know that Muslims are defeated. They have no bite. In other words, put it differently, the issue is there a will to resist? Muqawama, that word, that magic word. Is there a will to resist or no will to resist? What the entire Israeli project is that we want to break the Muslim will to resist. And that has reverberations and ramifications. You can't break the will to resist in Palestine, and there will be a will to resist in Bosnia. It doesn't work that way. You can't break the will to resist in Palestine, and there will be a will to resist in China or in Kashmir. And that is why we look at our reality today and we say, why were there no serious reaction to the Rohingyas? Because your will to resist has been broken. And it was not broken with Burma, it was broken with Palestine. And because you, in fact, in order to appease, let me put it very bluntly, in order to appease the Israelis, you have taught your children and taught your population, don't take this stuff about jihad and the stuff about Muslims being a single body, and don't take this stuff about the Muslim Ummah, and don't take the stuff about Khilafah very seriously. All of that to appease Israel and the Israeli project. Meanwhile, only if Muslims knew Hebrew and listened and studied Israeli discourses directly, they would see that while Muslims are embarrassed and very timid about what jihad is, or what the ummah is, or what the khilafah is, Israeli discourses are not at all timid. They don't say jihad, but they have the concept that we are dominating and defeating as a way of a holy war, as a way of serving God, is alive and well in Israeli discourses. And in fact, and that is where, by the way, someone like Trump, who thinks that he's serving God, and meets very well with Israeli extremism and the Israeli right wing, because the whole notion of we are servants of God and we are dominating Muslims as a service to God is so outspoken and so explicit. So the point, because I know that I've spoken too long, the point I want to close with is that anyone that turns on television stations like NBC, the Saudi controlled or owned, and by the way, unfortunately, the most popular TV station in the entire Arab-speaking world, NBC, or the channel Arabiya that is owned by Saudi, or you listen to the Emirati media, you are immediately struck by the extent to which there is an effort to deconstruct the place of Al-Aqsa Mosque and Jerusalem in Muslim consciousness, and to basically tell Muslims, all this stuff that you hear from intellectuals about Palestine and the Crusader Wars and the place of Palestine at the heart of the Muslim world, and etc., is nonsense. And in fact, all we need is to focus on Mecca and Medina. What they're effectively doing is turning Islam into an Arab desert religion, not universal anymore, not the heart of monotheism, but simply into a Bedouin phenomena. And this is what what inspired the Palestine Sermons, is that I see the danger of this very clearly. And the fracturing of Muslim consciousness is the greatest danger that is coming out of all of this. We can all witness a genocide, 50,000 people, and that's a conservative estimate, by the way. It doesn't count all the wounded and all the lost and all the, and yet we go on singing and dancing and partying and investing and so on, that's a complete fracturing of the Muslim consciousness. So the next that is going to come, India will slaughter Muslims in Kashmir and all over, and there will be no reaction. That's the precedent set. Precedent is very important. Historical precedent is very, very important. So this is what is behind the Palestine Sermons, and it is a I cannot imagine a more important intellectual battle than this right now. And let me stop here and yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Professor Abou El Fadl. We're talking about his book, The Palestine Sermons, which is actually a collection of his sermons that he has preached starting in 2018, going through 2024. You've brought up a number of points, and I encourage people to pick up the book because there's so much material in here. It's like a primer into thinking about this conflict and the many dimensions that Professor Abou El Fadl has raised. I see questions coming in, and I hope to address them or to pose them to Professor Abou El Fadl. I've also, you've put a lot of things on the table. I'll just say that one of the take-home points that I have gotten as I've read the book is the importance of our own agency as Muslims, as believers, as an ummah that is global and transcends a particular region, that we can blame no one but ourselves. And ultimately the future and the destiny of this conflict, maybe even of other conflicts and other salient global affairs issues are in our hands, and we shouldn't sit back, but we should engage them robustly. The other thing that I've heard is your central framing, which is that we are an ummah, that we are a body, because a number of people out there no longer accept this premise. And I think this is part of your argument, that we're in a situation now where some founding concepts are being deconstructed, that we're not even one body. I've heard you put out terms like apartheid, and we might add the term genocide on the table. And then you've mentioned the concept of history, maybe in relation to three subcategories of international law. Like the West set up this regime of human rights, and now it's being deconstructed by their own colonial projects. The idea of colonialism itself, and in relation to the construction of the Arab world and the leadership of the Arab world, and the idea of precedent, historical precedent, that if we were to accept this precedent in Palestine, then what's next? Then you also just touched upon briefly, it's a feature of your book, the role of the ulama and the obligation that scholars have at this particular moment. You spoke particularly in relation to Jerusalem, which also is a major theme in your book, but the importance of Jerusalem throughout Muslim history and for perhaps geopolitics, not just religious consciousness, but its geographic setting beyond simply the theological significance. And then with these, maybe one more, the idea of realism versus idealism, that when we analyze global affairs, there's one view, which is it's all in the interest of power and wealth and control of resources, or it's ideas. And in this case, you very much feel there's an ideological aspect to the conflict that's irreducible. Now, given all of that, I have three questions that I'll put, and then you can take them in any order. I prepared a set of questions. Maybe I'll come to them later, but I'm purely engaging, your remarks right now. One is not just the contention, but it's also another reality that the Palestine and concern for Palestine is not just a Muslim issue when it comes to the social justice movement. There are Christian allies, there are secular Marxists, social justice warriors, there are non-Zionist Jews who stand in solidarity with the Palestinians. And so when we frame it as a purely Muslim issue in these strong terms, one reaction could be that it might scare the heck out of some of our allies when we start talking about Khilafah and jihad. They might think that once we take back as Muslims Palestine, that where is it going to stop, and what will the place be for non-Muslims within that arrangement? And so could you address that? And then the third related one is when you express the importance of Jerusalem in Muslim history, that Islam came and it kicked the Byzantines out. And so is this just a cycle? Like we come and we kick some people out, and then others come and they kick us out. I'm just asking these because I understand how people might hear this. So I want to give you the opportunity to respond to maybe these three initially.
Yeah, it is actually it's not a cycle. What the Byzantines have we're in the East generally, Mashriq, as a foreign occupiers, and resistance to that foreign presence in different ways, even before the message of Muhammad ﷺ. I mean, that was a long history. And if Muslims, I mean, if Easterners generally were more active in writing their own history, these things would be much better understood by by Easterners generally, because but anyway, so it's not it's not a matter of a cycle. It is a matter of the Byzantines did withdraw from after the emergence of Islam from the East generally, and the efforts always to come back to Palestine were always in the context of perceiving in many ways, and often inventing an Islamic threat. I mean, it depended. Sometimes there was an aggressive Muslim phenomena, sometimes there wasn't. But and there's a lot of very, very rich historical work on why the West needed to invent the Muslim enemy and sort of create a Muslim boogeyman for a variety of reasons. But Jerusalem was always, and Palestine generally, was always seen as a symbol of monotheism, and because that is the birthplace of and the religious reality of the monotheistic message. And so there was always this ideological draw that those in control of Palestine are in control of what monotheism will mean and could mean.
Right. And if one of the things that at least my broad understanding of the historical record is that Muslim armies did not ethnically cleanse lands. When they conquered territory, it was more political, and there can be a conversation on the nature of those.
As insiders,
Right.
the indigenous, and it was even even among indigenous Christians and indigenous Jews, the relationship was very different than to those who were European. So it's not that is and in fact, what is important historically is that the existence of the West in Palestine in general was always the existence of a foreign phenomena. The West never succeeded in turning Palestine into, for instance, Spain, or what we managed to do in Andalus, where they, and that is because the indigenous factor in Palestine was remarkably ingrained and rooted. And of course, they also, I mean, there are complicated historical factors why they never managed to, although there were efforts to ethnically cleanse Palestine, but it never succeeded. What I'm now but that point that you've raised about what I am saying, and let's be very clear about this, is that what I'm saying is not that this is just a step in the creation of some scary boogeyman of Khilafah or something like that. I mean, all of this part of the colonial project was to alienate the Muslim consciousness from its own language, from its own symbols, from its own history. When one studies the symbol of Muslim unity, symbol in the word Khilafah, or in the institution of Khilafah, we know that it was a very complex historical phenomena. It had many shortcomings. It had many successes. It is not, you can't stereotype it into, but whether Muslims want to reclaim that symbol or not should be an autonomous Muslim issue. It should be up to Muslims to have the internal debates, free internal debates, and in the same way that, for instance, in the West, when there's a discussion about whether you want the European Union or you don't want the European Union, no mind, Europe doesn't bother for an instant about what Muslims think about their debates about the European Union. It doesn't even enter their consciousness. But it is not the same with Muslims. Muslims can't debate anything about their own fate without constantly being mindful of, is the West going to accept this? Is the West going to like this? And that is the calamity of the Muslim present, is that we don't even really understand the historical phenomena, the historical legacy of the Khilafah in any systematic, genuine, scholarly sense, because we have not had, all our debates were thoroughly politicized in the shadow of colonialism.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this is to your point, that, when we use elementary terms in our tradition, they're become trigger words, such that we have to check ourselves and explain in so many different ways and apologize for core concepts. And I think that this is to your point, that this is where we've ended up.
Yeah, personally, for me, I don't see the Khilafah as anything. The idea of an aggressive Khilafah that will knock at the doors of Vienna is absurd. I mean, it's a historical. In fact, what we've learned from these events is that this is not a good way to deal with the world. I see the Khilafah in the same way that I might see the European Union, an effort to for Muslims to because as separate polities, as nation states, they are vulnerable and weak. I see it as basically an effort to assert something about Muslim common destiny and a common purpose and a common cause, not to conquer the world, not to defeat the world, not to dominate anyone. So, but these debates can take place within if Muslims had enough autonomy to be able to conduct these debates without constantly worrying about trigger words. Now, I just want to comment because you raised a very important issue. Aside from, I'm talking about all of this to raise Muslim consciousness as to why Palestine is so important, because I keep hearing all the time, well, why are we focusing on Palestine? Well, isn't there Muslims are persecuted in Kashmir, Muslims are persecuted in China. Why are we so fixated on Palestine? And this is, you hear this all the time. And so much of what I'm saying is in response to that. But there is a separate and apart from that, there is a genuine human rights issue of a people who in our modern age have been under foreign occupation systematically and persistently since 1948. And the phenomena is so exceptional that the UN had to create a separate and special body called the UNESCO to take care of displaced and dispossessed Palestinians, because there is no other population that has been under systematic foreign occupation. And of course, Israeli scholars tried to come in and say, well, aren't the Kurds, aren't they been under foreign occupation? No, again, if you study history, there is no comparison between the Kurds and Palestinians. Or they'll say, well, how about the Basque in Spain? Haven't they been under foreign occupation? Again, knowledge of history would tell you there's no comparison between the Basque population and the Palestinians. So, as separate and apart as a human rights issue, it is truly, it represents the very logic of exceptionalism for the human rights regime in our modern age, which is a very, very dangerous precedent. Because if there is a systematic representative of exceptionalism, then the entire human rights edifice becomes shaky and endangered.
Yeah.
And it is no coincidence. It's not an accident that when China, every time, and again, the records of the UN speak for themselves. Every time the West have raised issues with Russia, Russia says, well, how about your voting record about the Palestinians? Every time the West has raised issues with China, the China responds, well, how about your voting record with Palestinians? So, in fact, this has happened. Palestine has become a representative of exceptionalism to the entire human rights edifice and structure.
Thank you. No, thank you. I think you've answered another question that was an important question that needs to be addressed, which is the question of the Palestinian exception. That why do we focus on Palestine and not Sudan, for example, or any number of other places, Ethiopia, where I just learned that 1.2 million people have been killed in a civil war this century. But you've answered it partly because of the long duration of the conflict, but also because of the way it's shielded by the very regimes that have that are supposed to correct imbalances and injustices
There
in
is
the
no, the West itself doesn't defend the human abuse
right,
in Ethiopia or Sudan or and 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 whatever shortages do occur because of not enough resources uh, committed to the regime of human rights generally in the world.
right,
Uh, Palestine has become a point where it basically is saying you Muslims um, are not entitled to the normal logic that would. So, for instance, uh, look at the what so many Western scholars who attempted to defend the Israeli genocide have started writing about asymmetrical warfare and how asymmetrical warfare the two principles of just war is Jus Cogen and Jus in Bellum. Sorry, not Jus Cogen. Jus in Bello and Jus in Bellum. A just war for a just cause and a just means in war, like proportionality and
mm,
discrimination. And though the Western scholars, in order to defend what Israel is doing, have been saying, well, this is the age of asymmetrical warfare. It's time to revisit the whole notion of just means in war. A just war doesn't need to be proportional. If it's okay, if they kill one, we kill 100. That is consistent with a dangerous precedent.
yeah,
And it doesn't happen with Sudan. It doesn't happen with Ethiopia. It doesn't happen with.
right. And yeah, and you mentioned in the book, I mean, I learned the concept of jus cogens, that there are certain things that are a priori not permitted, regardless of what is done to you. And if we were to accept that China is committing genocide against the Uyghurs, we wouldn't flatten Beijing. That's not the remedy. And so, those are all very important points. I see two hands up that participants have raised. We're not taking live questions on the mic, but if you could please type them in the Q&A chat box. I see 7 open questions in that chat box. So I'm going to go to those now. Some of them are constructive and move forward, and some of them are critical. And so I'm going to start and put a couple of the critical ones before you, and then you can as briefly as possible address those so that we can get as many of these questions as we can. So again, if you raised your hand, please type the question in the chat box. So some attendees are also typing anonymously, which is perfectly fine, and some have shared their names. So I will ask all questions anonymously.
Mm.
So one attendee has said that when he heard your speech in the beginning, your opening remarks, the importance of Israel and the way you frame that the West is ideologically invested in this, it makes it seem like Israel has too much control, and and that somehow Israel is controlling every aspect of what is happening in the Middle East, to the point that to them it's sounding like a conspiracy theory. And so what he's asking is, or she, this person, they are asking, what am I missing to see that Israel has this level of control? If this is the point you were making, how would you address this?
No, I think that is a misunderstanding of what I'm saying. Israel does not have that level of control. It does not. It is Muslims who uh, internalize the um, the values of their colonizers. It is the Muslim will itself that accepts that domination. So let's be very concrete. It is not Israel that punishes anyone who raises a Palestinian flag in the Emirat. It is Emirati authorities. You cannot raise the Palestinian flag in Egypt today without being arrested and disappearing. but it's not Israel who will arrest you. It is Egyptian authorities. It is not Israel who put Sisi in power, and Sisi is unabashedly subservient to Israel in every aspect, to the extent that Israel took control of the Rafah gateways and passage, and Egypt very meekly protested because the Egyptian army was charging Palestinians a lot of money to allow them to leave Gaza, and basically were making great profits from their control of the Rafah passages. It's not Israel who told the Egyptians to turn it into a profit-making venture and start charging Palestinians $10,000 to allow them to leave Gaza. And it is not Israel who told the Sisi regime that, be so subservient and so meek and so powerless. It is not Israel that tells Saudi or gives commands to Saudi to keep talking at the NBC and Arabiya and so on about how Palestine doesn't matter. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that it was Sisi came to power in Egypt with American support. If the Egyptian people would have rebelled and refused Sisi's leadership, I think Israel and the US could have done nothing. They would have had to accept the will of the Egyptian people. But the fact is that the Egyptian people did not rebel. We cannot ignore the fact that the greatest supporter of MBS is the United States, and that when MBS, it looked like that MBS might be punished for killing Khashoggi, we cannot ignore the fact that it was Netanyahu who was very active in the White House and in Congress, urging Americans not to punish MBS. But it's not Israel who told the Saudi people to accept the state of affairs and to remain docile and subservient and quiet. Same thing with the Emirat. Today, Muslims still go to Dubai and still enjoy themselves and spend tons of money in Dubai, although we all know that if you dare wear a shirt, Free Palestine in Dubai, you'll be arrested immediately. This is not Israel who told Dubai to be like that. But it is again, Muslims, including, unfortunately, Muslim theologians and scholars who are Dubai apologists, Emirati apologists, and there are tons of them. And if you know anything about the state of affairs today, if you are an Emirati apologist, you will live very comfortably and you will be rewarded very handsomely. So, no, it's not. It is, if you understood me as saying that, but what I am saying is that Muslims themselves cannot have discourses about their own historical institutions without a significant part of this discourse being what the West and the friends of Israel are going to think of your discourses. So I'm in the field. Try to be a scholar who talks about Islamic law, just Sharia. And you will find that you are either classified as a friend of Israel or as an enemy of Israel. And you will be either attacked as a scholar, as a quote unquote an anti-Semite, or as a good person, although your field is just Islamic law. And that's just the reality we live in. And that, frankly, I have to tell you, one of the things that as a teacher for 30 years is that I admire their commitment to their cause. I admire the extent to which they are assertive and vigilant and aggressive about listening to everything that might have direct or indirect relevance to their cause and uh, uh, their plans or whatever, and their determination in being heard. We have an opinion about what you're going to say because it affects us, and they're not shy about it, and they're not timid about it, and
This,
that's the difference between Muslims and frankly non-Muslim students.
this, you know, what you're saying right now is one of my favorite places. This comes the sermon you gave immediately after October 7th, on 13th October last year. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs. This is from his book, starting page 196 from the sermon. We are the repositories of these memories. We are the repositories of this history. Deep within the Muslim soul, the sense of tragic injustice feels incredibly familiar. It is as if our very psyches are saying, we have been here many times before. The remarkable thing about the colonial and racist narrative is that it is expressed in many different ways, but it always says the same thing. This narrative is as follows. I, the colonizer, am a sophisticated, layered, and complicated entity. The only way you can deal with me is by being fully cognizant of all the ways that I'm layered. You Muslim, Arab, African, or Palestinian, on the other hand, are a rather flat reality. I will deal with you, for the most part, by ignoring all the ways you are nuanced and layered. I will deal with you through sweeping generalizations. I will deal with you through simplistic litmus tests that categorize you as either good or bad. Beyond that, I will not allow you to detain me or engage my attention too much. I will ignore your history, including any claims to your land, resources, and right to self-determination. I will largely ignore everything that makes you a layered and cultured human being. I will ignore your poetry, music, and art. I will ignore your emotions and feelings. I will ignore your hopes and aspirations. You are only relevant to me to the extent that you disrupt my life. I have neither the time nor patience for your tragedies and memories of disempowerment and dehumanization. That does not affect how I relate to you. And then you mention here how the very first question becomes, do you condemn what has happened to me, without any acknowledgement of what has been happening to you? So very powerful. Again, this is the book we're talking about, the Palestine Sermons. We have about 10 minutes.
Thank you for reading that, because this is, thank you for reading this passage.
Yeah.
It really means a lot to me.
No, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for writing it. We're all deeply grateful. There's one more question, and then I'm just going to see if I can capture some of the constructive ones. And I may read as many as I can in a final word to allow you to respond. So we allow the audience to feel as involved and engaged in this conversation as possible. But if you haven't already asked a question, we probably will not be able to get to it. So I'm looking at what has already been submitted. So one person asks, a brother, I can tell by the name, when will the blood of Black people be as valuable as the blood of Arabs and other non-Black people to the Muslim community? And presumably, my sense as I read this question is the election is around the corner, and should our focus be overseas or here? Is it one community or the other? Maybe they're feeling that there's just the attention on Palestine outweighs all of the attention that's needed in other areas of injustice, maybe right here at home. So how would you engage this?
This is one of my biggest criticisms of current Muslim consciousness is the black issue is a racial issue. And as a racial issue, it is inseparable from all dark-skinned racism. Because racism against blacks cannot be separated from racism against all, and it is part of the false consciousness that colonialism has ingrained in Muslims, that somehow you can oppress blacks, but that doesn't affect Indian Muslims or doesn't affect Arab Muslims. Our cause is one and the same. Colonialism, in the same vein that it perpetuated the Inquisition in Spain and ethnically cleansed Spain and ethnically cleansed so many other areas, it also perpetuated the whole institutions of slavery and built its civilization on that ethnic cleansing and that racial phenomena. So, and I completely agree with you that unfortunately Muslims do not talk enough about race and about precisely racism, black racism, and slavery and the legacy of slavery and what it has created in the modern Muslim consciousness. So yes, absolutely.
Thank you. One question I have is around, Muslims dealing with their governments. So particularly, what kind of theology should Muslims develop today in this there's a number of questions wrapped up in here, but I think there's a core idea. What kind of theology should Muslims develop today in this seemingly impossible situation? How should we approach concepts like jihad and khilafah in our current context? I think some of that was already spoken to. Obviously, there's a lot more to address, and I hope we can have more such conversations. But then here's the unique aspect of this question. Additionally, in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, especially post 9/11, the government promotes the notion of moderate or humanitarian Islam, despite having potential ties to imperial agendas aimed at disciplining and shaping Muslim subjects to fit specific state interests. How should we respond to these narratives around moderate Islam, interfaith dialogue, Abrahamic accords, and faith and peace?
True understanding of Islamic history. I mean, and I would highly recommend this work. There was the late George Maqdisi wrote The Rise of Colleges in Islam, and then he wrote another book, The Rise of Humanism in Islam, to understand the extent to which the truth of the Islamic historical legacy was a humanistic legacy. Now, of course, I understand what the question is precisely getting at, is that the promoting of moderate Islam, it's one thing if you are saying that we want an Islam that is tolerant, that accepts human rights values, that respects the rights of the other to exist. That's one thing, and it's different than say we want an Islam that basically says, don't protest, don't object to racism. Let's pretend that we exist in a post-racial world. That's very problematic, and so these labels, moderate Islam, humanistic Islam, they conceal a very complicated reality that we must differentiate. The difficult thing that I will regularly acknowledge is that, as someone who was very familiar with the consequences of government repression, when a Muslim in Muslim lands will often be confronted with unrelenting, brutal government repression if they attempt to dissent or to be autonomous in any fashion. In other words, even attempt even today, as we speak, by the way, do you know that, for instance, Al-Azhar in Egypt is banned from saying anything about Palestine, is banned from saying anything about even its discourses are so tightly controlled. I think that puts such a burden on Muslims who manage to escape from this repression, and Muslims who enjoy the relative freedom that exists in the West. That is why I often in my speech and in my writings, I am very critical of American Muslims and Muslims in Europe, because there is a heavy Islamic obligation upon them to become powerful, to become effective, to make a difference, in order to use the institutions in their societies to relieve repression and lift some of the repression that exists on Muslims in Muslim lands. I mean, a very concrete example, I have worked very hard to punish the Egyptian government by having Congress withhold aid to the Egyptian government. I consider that my Islamic duty, because the Egyptian government has a horrible human rights record, a miserable human rights record, and they should not be receiving, they should not be rewarded by receiving tax dollars from the US. I wish more Muslims would have joined in a fight like that. I wish we understood, there were more Muslims who understood the significance of sending a message through the US to something like the Egyptian government, saying, we will not tolerate your systematic human rights abuses, and if the price we pay is that you ban us from visiting our homelands or confiscate our property back home, so be it.
Thank you. I think, yeah, you've answered this other question. I'll just voice it and just say a quick word in my own words in response to it, and then get to a final set of questions. We're actually at time, we had said 75 minutes, but we might stay just these extra 10 minutes to wrap up, if that's okay with you. So this one person asked, would we be, I think it's a sarcastic question, would we be able to have this conversation in any Muslim country? And I think that was already answered, no. And you know, when I hear a question like this, what I'd like to say is, you know, there are great aspects to there are lots of I want you to see me and Professor Abou El Fadl in an interesting way, as someone we're trying to better this country and the world. We're not against this country, and there are freedoms here that are valuable. They're being eroded. We have to protect them, but that's a privilege that we have, and we must use them in order to do the best we can to make the world a better place. And so nobody is saying by this that the Muslim world or the Muslim countries are perfect. In fact, the exact opposite has been said here.
In fact, can I just say that,
Sure.
as an American citizen, do you know that the amount of money that we have given Israel to slaughter Palestinians, do you know how many problems, if this money was redirected to American causes, to the urban centers, to our health system, to our school system, to our police, do you know how many problems can be fixed? One of my fields is human trafficking. Do you know that all police stations in the United States are so underfunded that they cannot respond to human trafficking, and human trafficking is an enormous problem in this country, and of course in the Muslim world as well. But the necessary tax dollars are wasted. So when I object as an American, because I care about this country. When I took an oath to the Constitution, I meant it, and I will live and die by it. And I believe that as a Muslim, it is entirely consistent with my system of beliefs as a Muslim. So no one can pull that card and try to pretend that, oh, well, you know, you're an agent who wants to undermine the US. No, I want what is good for the US, what I know will make the United States a truly a greater country, to use a Trumpian, make America great again. How can we be a great country if you see the homeless, you see the problems with our system of education, you see the problem with drugs, you see the problems with human trafficking, all underfunded, and then all this money goes to Israel. It offends me as a U.S. citizen.
Thank you. So the final two set of questions, maybe one I'll take, just address, you know, again, how do we decolonize the mind? You know, I would encourage you to read these sermons and go to teachers and scholars, read widely. Don't just read in one area. And you've been given, you know, as believers, you've been given a rationality by God. And we pray that God illuminate your soul. Study everything, talk to everybody. And this is one contribution that, you know, we feel is deeply meaningful towards that end. A second set of questions then, this is the last set I'm going to take from the Q&A, and then I'm going to pose my closing question to you. So this question is about the hatred that has been fueled by this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So some people are wondering, you know, where do we go from here? Like, how do we live in peace? How can we rekindle love for each other? And a related question to that is that the conflict has been going on now for, we're touching the 8th decade. And there are people who live in Israel, whether or not we believe it to be a colonial project, who have no other home. They have been born there and raised there, much like many Americans here in the post-native genocide. And so I know also that, you know, I'm in part of multiple institutions. We often begin with the land acknowledgement, but we're on that land, right? So we acknowledge it, but we don't move away. We have to find another way. And so given this complexity, both the enmity that's there and then the facts on the ground, if you will, the time that has passed, how do you see this moving forward?
I would never support an ethnic cleansing in Palestine against Jews. That would be entirely un-Islamic and unacceptable. What I am saying is give Palestinians in this land equal rights. I would be the first to stand up and oppose if Palestinians got their rights and started persecuting Jews in Palestine. I would be the first to reject that and to be very loud in protesting it, because as a Muslim, I do not accept oppression or the persecution of any group. These are the ethics I learned from Islam. I mean, I've been active in the Human Rights Watch for 30 years, and every time they say, "Oh, you know, it's so wonderful that as a Muslim you're committed to human rights principles," and I was served on the board of directors of Human Rights Watch at one point, and I told them I do so as a Muslim because it is the ethics I learned from my Prophet, from my Quran. It's not the ethics that I learned from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or whatnot. So let's be very clear. This is in no way is saying that, oh, let's ethnically cleanse Jews or let's throw them in the ocean. And that is entirely immoral, entirely unacceptable. So that's one. The second thing, please understand the conflict. It is not an accident. It is not a coincidence that in order for Israel to dominate Palestinians thoroughly, that Israeli activists found themselves in a situation where they became allied with the Christian right and nurtured the industry of Islamophobia. Remember that people like Daniel Pipes and from staunch Zionists and someone like Robert Spencer, a right-wing Christian, became natural allies in generating the entire industry of Islamophobia, Islam hating, which is, by the way, a very racist discourse. It's a racist institution. Why? Because they understood very well that you need Islamophobia to perpetuate the ethnic cleansing of Muslim populations wherever it's necessary to ethnic cleanse Muslim populations, whether this is in Palestine or whether this is in with even Black Muslims in the U.S., or to completely dominate them and render them powerless, or whether this is in Kashmir. That is why India itself, today's India, the Indian government plays an integral part in the institutions of Islamophobia, in the industry of Islamophobia. So it is not the conflict that happened in Gaza that is the reason for the enmity. The reason for the enmity is the determination of basically the colonial legacy, the legacy of colonialism, to continue dominating indigenous populations and dark-skinned people. And there is a whole field of study called subaltern studies. And I'll use that term, subaltern populations, to keep the world a largely controlled by the white civilization, and keep subalterns, which includes Muslims, as subalterns. Now, of course, India has been trying to basically invite itself to the white table and say, excuse me, can we be considered treated differently? And can you please not consider us as subalterns and forget about our dark skins, and because we're not Muslims, and as non-Muslims, we can do pass as white, basically. It remains to see whether India will be successful in that, but I have my serious doubts that it will ever succeed. But that is what is critical for us to understand, is that it is a racial issue, a colonial issue, an issue of the nature of the dominant civilizational paradigm in which the white man is at the top of the helm, at the very head of the pyramid, and everything else is below.
All right. Well, this has been an incredible conversation, and I can already feel that we need to do more of these. We're deeply grateful that you joined us. But before I formally close, I have to ask you, you can deny answering this question and just offer us a few closing remarks from your own heart. But next week on Tuesday, there's a presidential election. And a few weeks ago, a cluster of American imams, they published an open letter inviting Muslims to vote their conscience while making it clear that neither Trump nor Harris are worthy of our vote. And so they encouraged third party. And the Muslim community is deeply divided on this question. Obviously, the frame being the lesser of the evils. And so your book, as I read it, and as you passionately explained here, is an invitation to democracy, to individual excellence, to robust moral participation in public life. What advice would you give?
I mean, it is let me put it, Muslims have consistently in the West the whole, and this is part of, by the way, uh, uh, the rapture between immigrant populations and Black Muslims, in especially in the U.S., have always wanted, basically, if there is seat, wanted to be invited to the seat of power and to accept uh, whatever morsels um, are thrown to them, um, in, by being invited to the seat of power, whether they are doing it with Trump, or doing it with Republicans, or doing it with Democrats, is please just accept us. I- I- They they have not come to terms with the reality that this dynamic means that you will never be allowed to achieve anything but what the hegemonic, the powerful want you to achieve. In other words, you will never amount to anything. Of course, I do think Muslims should vote their conscience. That's sure. I have a very serious problem with voting for someone who is openly Islamophobic, who openly said Muslims have no rights over Jerusalem, who openly is the cause for the October 7th, by ignoring Palestinians completely and saying we're going to do the deal of the century and we'll just cut out Palestinians of the entire thing, and hence, you know, set the ball rolling. And I also have a very big problem with a regime that not just accepted Israeli genocide, but actually is responsible for the genocide, because they gave Israel all the arms, all the support. They have not denied Israel one request for all the explosives and all the missiles, all the whatever Israel wanted, Israel got. And I think it is time for Muslims to think about allying themselves with parties who stand out of these dynamics of power as protesters, as people who speak truth to power, and looking for where their allies could be in this tapestry. So yeah, vote your conscience, but keep in mind that a vote, you whatever vote you render, you must defend in the hereafter, because you will be asked about it. I have no doubt about that. God will ask you about, like God will ask you about any decision you make. And one of these decisions is who you ended up supporting.
Thank you. And, I heard some wise advice also the other day, that play the long game. So if you think your participation is limited to showing up every 4 years, and then that's not the way that change will come. Get involved locally, pay attention, advocate within your sphere of influence, and then support the kinds of people at the local level. So in time, they can germinate a new conversation and new policies.
And for students out there, think about, if God gives you the talent to be involved in politics and to run for office. I want Muslims to run for office. I want Muslims not to sit on the sidelines, and to
Right.
be involved, and to feel this is their country, and the well-being of this country is their own well-being.
Right. And then those who run, to not ignore them, because we're looking at the big people on the top, but to actually pay attention to those voices that are already there at the local levels, and then we need more. So, all right, with that, we bring this conversation to a close. Thanks to everyone who joined us today from near and far. To learn more about Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl and his work, check out usuli.org, that's USULI.org, and searchforbeauty.org. It's one word, searchforbeauty.org. This conversation has been brought to you by American Islamic College in Chicago. We are AICUSA.org, and a recording will be made available to the public afterwards. I'd like to thank the AIC team, in particular, Brother Masood, for helping in setting up this webinar, and Joseph Linhoff, who edited these sermons, and Grace Song for facilitating the collaboration with Usuli Institute and AIC. Professor Khaled Abou El Fadl, thank you for your voice, for your courage, and for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.